Do you see this boring and flat raw file right here? No real color differentiation, no lighting? Well, I'm gonna change that today by taking this raw file and turning it into a picture like this at the end. And a big shout out to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. They have over 15,000 structured courses about photography, videography, design, marketing, and pretty much everything else that you can think of. So if you want to learn more, then check out the link in the video description below. Alright, so with the overall picture here, I actually want to make it overall a little bit more bluish. So I'm going to go into the minus color temperature here, and I might even add a little bit of magenta tint. Then going into all of the dark parts first, the dark adjustments, as you can see the shadows are quite black and kinda dark. So what I want to do is raise the shadows a little bit here by around 40 and also raise the blacks by quite a bit, although not quite as much as the shadows. And that is so I can actually bring the contrast to the right. And as you can see, if I bring the contrast to the right, it will just make the whole picture more punchy and just contrasty. So by bringing up the shadows and blacks though, it allows me to do that without clipping any blacks and the dark parts. So that's a very, very important thing. Then going to the clarity, this is a very difficult thing, but especially if there is so many textures and so many things in a photo, then I really prefer to go into the minus. It works with the winter mood too. So in terms of the vibrance and saturation, this is actually something quite difficult because at the moment I don't really know what my colors are gonna be like. So let's just leave them out for a second and go into the highlights. Now here I always like to bring down the highlights, and that is so I can go into the plus whites. So the difference between the two is that the highlight slider is just a very broad brightness adjustment, so it doesn't really have a real characteristic to it. Whereas the white slider just makes the more brightish parts more bright, and that results in a very dynamic picture that just happens to look more punchy, more contrasty, and honestly how I prefer it. So you can also hold down the Alt key to see if you clip anything, meaning that you see if some areas become pure white. As you can see now, some of the parts in the sky are just pure white. So you just kind of want to keep it below clipping a huge amount of the picture. Then going to the tonal curve, let's actually skip that because I don't really think that has too big of an adjustment in this picture, and go straight away into the split toning. And split toning is a very, very important thing. So, okay, let's just take a look at the picture. It looks very bluish, and even though I want some blue for the snow and, you know, the overall cold mood, I still want to go here to the highlights, go to the little box, and just add some warm tones here, and look at the difference. It is already such a huge difference from before to after, but I'm even gonna go into the shadows and add a little bit of magenta here. So with the shadows, you really have to look out. You can't go as far as with the highlights, but just like 10 or 15 can work quite a lot of the times. So let me tell you why split toning is so important. From before, again, it just looks very bluish, and I actually went for that intentionally because with the split toning you can add colors to just certain parts of the picture, and with the highlights it adds more color towards the highlights and bright parts such as the snow, the lights here, and it just makes it seem more realistic if you add warm tones there rather than if you do it in the color temperature or in the overall color scheme. It's way more selective that way, and it creates differentiation, and it also makes everything look more natural. Going down though, detail, not really want to fine tune any of the sharpening and the detail stuff so much, so let's go into the lens corrections. And as you can see here, there's so much chromatic aberration, all of these green and purple lines around the contrasty stuff just looks terrible, and by clicking on this little box it just removes it. So you don't even have to go into the manual and adjust any of that yourself, just click on this little box and it will take care for you. So going further, enable profile corrections is something very important as well, and you just want to choose your lens, in this case actually the Canon 18-55 kit lens. That will remove the lens vignetting or the dark corners here on the edges, and it will also get rid of the lens distortion. So as you can see, it looks a lot better and a lot more straight here, but still there is a little bit of distortion. For example, if you look at this sign, it just isn't super straight. So what I'm gonna do is go to transform and just click on auto, and because there are so many lines that Lightroom could use, it does a really great job. And from before to after, it just looks way better, way more professional. So a very important thing to at least try that out if you have a lot of architecture and lines. Other than that, in like landscapes, it might not be super important. Going to the effects though, I actually want to add some custom vignetting, and for that, just showing you the extreme example, I want to bring down the midpoint quite close to the center, and also make the feather or the whole graduation of the effect very soft. And then with the actual amount, just a hint around -12, so from before to after, it just helps the overall mood, and you have much more fine control over this kind of vignetting rather than the lens vignetting itself. So with that being said, I think that's pretty much all I'm gonna do in the global adjustments for now. There is maybe some more color adjustments that I'm gonna do towards the end, but for now I want to go into the local adjustments. So first of all, I'm gonna grab a graduated filter and just make this bottom a little bit darker. Now with these graduated filters, it's important that you have kind of a soft edge, because if you have a very harsh edge and you make an adjustment, as you can see, it just looks very unnatural and not really blends in with the rest of the picture. So a little bit darkness and minus exposure in the bottom here, also the same in the top, and that is so it closes out the picture, again kind of a custom vignetting. And then I'm gonna grab a graduated filter, a very big one over the right part of the entire picture, and go a little bit into the plus exposure here, while going into the colors and just adding a little bit of color. Now what you want to go for is very much up to you, but I think because this is kind of an overcast picture, very close to sunset by the way, I think I'm gonna add some additional red tones here, and again, just a hint to add a little bit more complexity and interest, and not really to overblow the entire photo. And while I'm at it, I'm even gonna grab another filter kind of in parallel, so also a very big one, and this time go a bit into the minus exposure, and also go into the color and maybe even go for a mix between purple and bluish, and really only add like 5, 6, 7% here. So by going into the minus exposure with one side of the picture and going into the plus exposure with the other side, you have a much more interesting lighting scheme. And as you can see from before, it just looks very generic, very even, and afterwards there is already a huge difference in terms of that lighting, and it just enhances the whole natural look. And you know, before I say that I'm done with the graduated filters, I'm even gonna add another one over the very right part of the sky, and perhaps even go more into the red tones, so that way there's even a differentiation of the color within the sky itself. So differentiation, whether it be in terms of the colors for the sky right here, or in terms of the exposure for the left and right side of the picture, differentiation is a very key element to making your picture look interesting. And before I go into the last local adjustment, which is the radial filter for some dodge and burning, I think I'm actually gonna go back to the color temperature. And even though I said I wanted to make this whole picture relatively cool and bluish, I still think I have to fine-tune it a little bit, and also the tint perhaps just a little bit less into the magenta. So it's always great to go back and fine-tune something and then come back to another adjustment. Don't just go according to the row, you know, from left to right, from top to bottom. Really make it fluid, at least once you get to know all of the adjustments. So anyhow, now with the radial filters for dodge and burning, the last global entire adjustment that I think I'm gonna make to this picture, and I'm gonna start off by bringing up the exposure, up the whites, and also adding a little bit of warm tones here into the color. And the reason I'm doing that, so let me just add a filter right here. The reason I'm doing that is so I can increase the complexity and again the dynamic, both in terms of the color as well as the exposure in the entire picture. So for example, this car, maybe it looks a little bit boring, maybe it could use a little bit more exposure on the streets, so it looks as if the headlights would have brought more lights on the actual street. Then you can just right click duplicate and bring it over another part. And here in this hotel area there are some lights, but they just don't really pop, they're very muted. So what I want to do here is just right click and duplicate and add some filters to bring that whole light and brightness out a bit more. And if I just show you the difference from these few filters to after, it's already so much more interesting. And by the way, if you don't want to always right click and duplicate, you can just hold down your front / key and it will duplicate the filter that way. So what I want to do now is increase the overall complexity, the overall dynamic again of the entire picture. And I want to do that by just adding some plus exposure on some of these parts. Now the very important thing here is that you don't just go over the dark parts and make them brighter, you know, always kind of look where's the light already hitting, where could I just amplify it rather than just making something completely fake and unnatural. So right click duplicate or front / key. By the way, you can even hold down the Alt key and then just drag a filter over another place, so that way you don't even have to press anything and it's very fast. But what I'm gonna do first of all is just a very broad brightness adjustment. So maybe I'm even gonna add a little bit more warm tones now and cut down on some of the whites as well as the exposure. And that's really a great thing about these filters, you can stack them on top of each other and you can really have so much complexity in a very simple format. So going a little bit further, you know, just making this entire road a little bit warmer, perhaps not quite as much, but you always want to look at the whole lighting scheme. You don't just want to, you know, do something like this and go into the crazy colors. That just doesn't work. You always want to keep it at least somewhat natural. Even if you prefer to have a very heavily edited picture at the end, you still kind of want to have that, you know, connection to reality and to what looks realistic. So going a little bit further though, now I'm making quite a big one over this entire place, this entire house. And the thing with these rail filters, you could even zoom in and make a very small adjustment, you know, just kind of for one part of a window, for example. But since this is going to take a lot of time and, you know, I've done separate dodge and burning tutorials in the past, I think I'm not really going to do too much of that, but rather go for the very broad and kind of big adjustment filters. So now I think that's pretty much all I'm gonna do in terms of the plus exposure. So let's go into the minus exposure after resetting everything. And also add some minus blacks, maybe even add some contrast and just going over the already dark areas. And pretty much doing the exact same thing as I did with the plus exposure, just now instead of making the bright parts more bright, making the dark parts more dark. And the reason you want to do all of that dodge and burning stuff is again to make everything more complex, more interesting. And the dark parts are also a very important thing and a very important aspect of that, because if you make everything very bright and very, you know, just kind of overexposed, it doesn't look very contrasty or interesting anymore. So you always want to make sure that you also add at least some minus exposure filters. Some pictures that are very bright and naturally don't need so much minus exposure at all. But then again, if you have a kind of dark, overcast, black and white picture, for example, then maybe even minus exposure filters become more important than the plus exposure ones. So let's just right click duplicate, you know, just add some complexity in the entire picture. And I promise you I'm done very soon, just a few more filters over here. So yeah, that's the whole dodge and burning that I'm gonna do to this picture. This is from before, this is after, and I mean, it's a huge difference. Perhaps a little bit too much into the colors in some of these filters, but always keep in mind this is kind of a very quick, fast-paced tutorial, so it's not really all about refining all of the colors perfectly. But I think I'm pretty happy in terms of the dodge and burning, so now what I'm gonna do is some of the last refinements, some of the last touches, and one would be definitely bringing up the vibrance a little bit here. I do want to add a little bit more color here, so that looks pretty good. Also can play around with the saturation of course, but I prefer to just add a bit of vibrance. It kind of works better in a lot of the cases. Maybe I'm gonna bring down some of the shadows here in the tonal curve just to make some of these very dark parts a bit more dark and contrasty. And with that being said, I think that's pretty much it. Let's go into the history here and see how the picture looked at the very start. This is the raw file, and I mean, it's a huge difference. It's so much more flat and boring if you just ask me, compared to afterwards where you have so much lighting, so much color, and I'm just a very big fan of this style of editing. I know it's not for everyone, but keep in mind you can just go a quarter as much, half as much as I've gone, and you can just use certain tools and adjustments rather than everything that I have done here. With that being said though, if you would like to learn more about Lightroom and photo editing in general, I can really recommend you Skillshare. They just have so many structured and long courses about Lightroom and photo editing. They go much more into detail than what I could give you here in one YouTube video. You know, taking this course as an example, how to edit cityscape pictures, it's very interesting to see this photographer's perspective on how he shoots, what he thinks about, all of the compositional elements that are important, what he wants to edit this picture into, how he edits. It's just very structured and very informative. And this is just one of many awesome photography editing courses. There's also a whole section about videography, about marketing, business, about design, and so much more. So if you want to learn more about this and check out some courses, you can actually get a 2-month free trial by checking out the link in the video description and using the offer code YuriFineart. Paid subscriptions start from less than $10 a month. I believe it's around $8 depending on the plan you go for. And then after having full access and testing out everything for 2 months, you can decide for yourself whether you want to go for a paid subscription or not. So yeah, thank you very much for watching this video, and if you have any feedback or questions, comments, just leave them in the comments down below. I'm gonna try to reply to all of them. And other than that, just keep on editing great pictures. Take care, guys.